If you've never heard about the Moomin Trolls before, that might be a result of their strangely specific international reach. And for those people, we suppose a short introduction is necessary. Originally created by Finno-Swedish artist and author Tove Jansson in a series of 8 core books and a daily newspaper comic strip, these stories usually center around a plump fantasy creature Moomin Troll and his family. With an initial basis in a mix of grand adventure journeys and slice-of-life coziness, the books went through a metamorphosis to become increasingly somber and thoughtful stories on the intricacies of life that seemed clearly geared more towards adults than children. This touch of maturity would be key for securing audiences of all ages and remain relevant to this day. There's honestly so much to get into here that it could fill an entire video. Would you like that? Like a Moomin primer that just goes to lengths on introducing everything you need to know and charting a comprehensive canon? Tell us in the comments. Anyway, the gist is that Moomin Troll, his family, friends, and lover, Snufkin, reside in a peaceful valley and do cool valley stuff. The books and characters are obviously well known and popular in their home country of Finland as well as Sweden, seeing as the stories were written in Swedish. Though further spread in the rest of Europe is varied, mostly dependent on different kinds of adaptations. Funnily enough, they might be the most popular in Japan of all places, which is probably an entire subject on its own. But we digress. Looking at translations and localizations of the stories from Moomin Valley, there's always a kind of local flavor to it. Famously, Richard Murdoch's telling in the British dub of the Polish Felt television series made everything very pleasantly English.
The golden tale is delightful, but oh, the rest, simply not our class, milady.
While German and Soviet adaptations likewise allow themselves to be colored by their respective cultures. Most significant is how Japan made Moomin into an anime thrice with all the cultural background that came with that. But again, we digress. What this means in practice is that there is rarely anything inherently Finnish in how the Moomins are appropriated abroad. We mean, the latest television series even unceremoniously tossed out the folky Moomin music for modern indie tunes, which kind of killed the vibe, to be honest. The only real traces left are the generally Nordic themes inherent to the setting and tone of the stories. For example, a book like Moominland Midwinter is so ridiculously Scandinavian in how dreadfully intense the winter is that it's probably only truly relatable to the Nordic countries. And Russia. Plus Canada. Alaska. Moomin Valley is a place of midnight sun, hibernating fauna, sparse nature, local cuisine culture, nautical romanticism, dangerous midsummers, drunk fathers, and Finnish chocolate product placements. This Nordic identity is only truly evident if you dig deep, delve around in the stories, and give them context. For every country except Sweden, that is. You see, in Sweden, the Moomin Trolls only need to say one sentence, and not only are we aware of their Finnish origin, it solidifies that cultural background to such a drastic degree that the idea of the Moomins indeed being Finnish is basically their core identification here. let's starting off by getting some context first. From the 12th to the 19th century, Finland was occupied by its neighbor kingdom Sweden, and as such, economic and cultural trade would obviously follow until Finland was overtaken by its other neighbor, Russia, for a century between 1809 and 1917, until Finland was finally liberated. This means that Finland as an independent nation is surprisingly young despite its long-spanning history. It's just that this is a history of occupation and conflict. The relationship between Finland and Sweden is a touchy one, especially if you give weight to the implication of a Swedish point of view, which we as Swedes inherently harbor. In Sweden, we see Finland as perhaps our best buddy nation, with Norway as a potential second candidate. However, from a Finnish angle, our fondness might easily be seen as condescending and patronizing from a historical context, where Sweden saw Finland as more of a landmass that gave us territorial war benefits, rather than anything of substantial value.
Kapten Gars kommer att bli mycket glad över att ge sig ut i krig igen.
Despite once being part of the same kingdom, Finns and Swedes were absolutely not seen as the same equal people, and that undoubtedly shaped how the cultures were formed. Especially up in the far north, this kind of cultural divide still exists both for Finns, but also the Sami people. The perception of Finns, and by effect Finland, as a quaint backwaters country is sadly still a perception that crops up to this day, despite Finland perhaps being better off socially than Sweden. But today, with Finland's liberation being in everyone's collective past, the two countries finally seem to have somewhat of an international perception as equals, what with them being separate entities for just above 100 years. Official relationships are now splendid, with 20th century seeing high trade of products, culture, and children. Yeah, about that. Anyway, with Finnish being an Uralic language and Swedish being North Germanic, the prospects of the two blending and intermingling, like Swedish easily does with Norwegian and Danish, wasn't really that high during the whole occupation thing. The two were simply so incompatible that the Swedish language miraculously survived in Finland throughout the centuries, mainly in rural villages along the southwestern coastline, closest to Sweden, with Åland still to this day speaking Swedish as their main language. Granted, this is not without controversy, of course, as in the 1970s, Swedish became a mandatory subject in Finnish schools, with Finnish being a mandatory subject for Finno-Swedes. This forced a language of highly varied relevance on the entire population to, let's say, mixed reception. The idea was that academics would be able to use both languages officially, but in practice, it contributed more to souring the already fragile relations between the two groups. Even predating this, the cultural ramifications of two languages coexisting in Finland meant that Swedish-speaking Finns had their own little cultures semi-independent of the larger Finnish one. It's hard to really showcase the lingual difference when presenting this in English, but in short, Finno-Swedes speak a form of Swedish that is vividly distinct from mainland Swedish dialects. Certain spoken letters have a different emphasis that can either make words sound more drawn out and with different melodic quality. You see, when Tove Jansson, by experience of being Finno-Swede, wrote the Moomin books, she did so in her mother tongue. This worked completely fine for the first 4 books without any real hitch when they were exported to Sweden, which had a larger demographic of potential readers. In fact, during the 40s, it's very likely that people read these books with no clue as to where they came from, because it was both unimportant and non-apparent from the writing itself. Come 1952, however, and the first Moomin picture book was released. Hur gick det sen? Boken om Mymlan, Mumintrollet och Lilla My roughly translates as What Happened Next, the book about Mimble, Moomintroll and Little My, the latter sentence in modification being its English title. This is when things get interesting, as this is a book written in rhyme, and already in the first spread, we reach our first roadblock. Och vinden suckade och ven I skogens alla mörka trän. The two rhyming words in the original version are supposed to be ven and trän, but when read in standard Swedish, they quite frankly do not rhyme at all. Ven, trän. Nope. Unless...
Och vinden suckade och ven I skogens alla mörka trän.
This is just a super insignificant little line in a picture book, but it was the first moment where Swedish readers had to take a step back and reevaluate how they were supposed to read the story. The word pronunciation for these rhymes downright demanded that you had to read them in Finno-Swedish for proper harmony. But, well, this was just one book, and none of the main novels are written in rhyme, so this one line didn't necessarily have any long-lasting effect on how the rest of Tove Jansson's output would be read. Soon after, she even started the Moomin newspaper strips, which were written in English for an international audience, something that certainly could have given an impression of the cultural heritage of the Moomins being ultimately insignificant, especially as this new version of the family was explicitly from England instead of Finland. However, just the fact that the Moomin stories were written and created in Finland meant that sooner or later, the Finno-Swedish quality would bleed through anyway. During 1958, Lilla Teatern, the little theatre in Helsinki, specifically aimed to only perform new plays by Finnish authors, a bold but effective move for furthering the contemporary Finnish theatre scene. Spearheading the theatre was Tove Jansson's old friend and, actually, ex-girlfriend, Vivica Bandler. Already in 1949, the two had collaborated on a Moomin play which only saw a limited Finnish run before being disbanded. The experiences with this would go on to inspire the novel Moomin Summer Madness, in which the Moomin family stranded on a floating theatre set after a cataclysmic flood. Having a fond relationship to the theatre scene, as well as a friend within the industry, it was only a matter of time before Tove Jansson would return to the medium. Following a brief puppet theatre with characters co-created by Tove and her mother, the local direction of the little theatre that year led her back to her friend to write a new proper stage play. The result was Troll I kulisserna, or Troll in the Wings, and the proverbial Finno-Swedish Moominsment was starting to get mixed. Written by Tove Jansson, directed by Vivica Bandler, with music by Erna Taro, and with an equally all-Finno-Swedish cast. Poster child would be Lasse Pöysti, who played Moomintroll on stage with such conviction that people immediately took his performance to heart. That's it, that's the primordial Moomintroll, and there he was, speaking full-on Finno-Swedish.
Och snart går solen upp. Det blir solsken. Och vad är det där? Men det är ju min Nisa.
The stage play was a loose adaptation of Moomin Summer Madness, with a now complementary meta-element of the actors finding themselves both on a fictional and physical theatre stage at the same time, on which they then perform a makeshift performance. After the fire chief reads about a flood in an 8-year-old newspaper, he evacuates Moomintroll, Little My, Filajunk and Missabel onto the theatre where they meet Emma, who's running the place, although more as a janitor than as a director. It's in this meeting of drastically different issues and philosophies that the meat of the play revolves. The idea of these characters performing a meta stage play is more of an excuse for the personal chemistry between them to blossom. Perhaps most infamously, the play contains a scene in which the fire chief removes Moomintroll's nose, which in practice means the bulky mask for actor Lasse Pöysti. This was a carryover from problems with the 1949 play. At the time, putting masks over the actors' heads highly limited audibility and eyesight, and posed a safety risk with breathing and overheating. The playfully macabre twist of straight-off decapitating Moomintroll on stage to solve the mask issue, and by process, revealing the actors underneath, was just a sign of the kind of dark humor Tove Jansson enjoyed so much, and was something she and Viveca Bandler agreed would be fun to do for shits and giggles. Following its Finnish run, Troll in the Wings would move over to Stockholm and then tour around Sweden before finally arriving in Norway over the next 2 years. Mind you, at the time, performing a stage play in Sweden with an all-Finno-Swedish dialect was more or less unheard of. As such, the production was a bit of a risk, as it mixed a way of speech that was associated with quaint country folks from across the pond, rather than the fine and proper high society flair of the other stage drama. Now, far from being overtly controversial or unruly, the rift was more from a conflict between the two cultures, as written in Swedish evening press Aftonbladet at the time.
A lot of the Moomin play's delight lies in the leisurely singing Swedish-Finnish dialect that is just for this once an asset in a dramatic context.
This puts a positive angle on the dialect of the actors, especially in the context of coming from Moomin characters, but it carries an air of condescension. More like a novelty, the idea that the quaint way of speech had found a proper contextual use for once, rather than supposedly being a detrimental factor to the acting. However, the widely positive reception of the stage play did serve as a first step towards a much-deserved change of pace. Viveca Bandler believed that it was integral to perform the Moomins in particular, as it would allow the audience to disengage their previous associations with the spoken dialect, as written in an interview with her before the premiere in Stockholm.
It's always a bit sensitive for Finno-Swedes to perform plays in Stockholm, says Viveca Bandler concerned. It's about the language, that Swedes in Sweden have such a hard time to realize that it is Swedish we speak. Us too. You get moderately flattered when they say, "Oh, how well you speak Swedish," almost without an accent. Or, "I didn't know it was so easy to understand Finnish." Now, she's got her hopes on Moomin. Shouldn't at least he, who's just a troll, be allowed to express himself in Eastern Swedish?
Luckily, she was right in this, and the Swedish run of Troll in the Wings opened the door for the Little Theatre to subsequently perform their plays in Sweden annually from that point onwards, with every performance helping to further distance public perception of Finno-Swedes and their dialect from preconceived notions. 10 years later, Viveca Bandler would find herself as manager of the Stockholm City Theatre, which further contributed to the normalization of Finno-Swedes in this context. You still had to be on location and buy a ticket to see the show, but the success of Troll in the Wings and later productions meant that this indeed worked and would continue. One of the many television adaptations of the Moomins was the 1969 show Mumintrollet, broadcasted on Swedish national television. Back in the Saddle were the key players from Troll in the Wings, with an additional contemporary all-star cast of actors, most notably Gösta Ekman, with Lasse Pöysti once again filling his role as the definitive Moomintroll. The Finno-Swedish identity of the Moomins was further solidified, an identity emphasized by the Moomin character's literal cultural conflict with the king in the story, who fixates on the family being an outcast minority and how preposterous this is.
Ska man ha en minoritet kan de väl åtminstone se ut som folk?
The gist of the show is how the king tries to civilize the Moomin family by making them appear more like people. This is where that gag of removing the characters' noses goes full circle and gains substantial meaning over just being some twisted humor, as it now revolves around an outside authority attempting to make the explicitly stated minority look more human. This is followed by the king inviting the family to his castle to re-educate them to behave in a desired fashion. However, that backfires as the king is drawn in by the family's lifestyle and moves over to Moomin Valley to instead re-educate himself, with the show closing on him declaring that the Moomin family from then on will be allowed to look and behave however they wish. A subtle way of portraying the Moomin identity was to divide the nationality of the actors based on what so-called faction they belonged to. The Moomin family are all Finno-Swedes, while the king and his cohorts are mainland Swedes. This simple but brilliant casting direction meant that the othering of the Moomins felt more substantial, and while the approach to this subject was primarily from a comedic angle, that contemporary socio-political theme was far from hidden. With this television show, Vivica Bandler's previous goal of normalizing Finno-Swedes in Swedish drama had been fulfilled to a much greater extent than with the previous stage play. The show was aired on national television and was one of the programs to launch the then completely new and radical idea of a second television channel. Whoa! As such, this simple little family show was boosted as a flagship program for TV2 and was one of the main occasions when people all over the country sat down in front of the television set for the novelty of trying out this second channel. Peak Moomin exposure meant great cultural impact. Perhaps most felt in the widespread disappointment of the actors under the suits being revealed. But that's life. Lasse Pöysti would go on to portray Moomintroll again in story tapes, radio readings, and during a special appearance for charity, making him the actor that portrayed the character in Sweden the most times, spread out over almost 30 years. Although the stories have been adapted in standard Swedish a couple of times since, this initial casting and exposure birthed the idea in the Swedish consciousness that Moomintroll is inherently Finno-Swedish. For example, with the 1973 adaptation, criticism was aimed towards the characters not speaking the dialect. So already by this point, it had become so essential that omitting it felt weird to people. The same sentiment was reflected in criticism against the 1980s short film Who Will Comfort Tuffle. Reviewer Pia Gadd missed the voice of longtime Moomin contributor Birgitta Ulfsson, who had read out several Moomin stories on radio and narrated other shows, such as the Swedish dub of the Polish Felt animated show. Perhaps most definitely, Tove Jansson's increased public presence in film and radio meant that people more firmly associated the creator of Moomin with Finland. Be it televised appearances or radio readings of her later books aimed at adults, she was heard both figuratively and literally. It's no wonder then that when the 90s anime rolled around, previous criticism had been taken into consideration and the entire cast of the Swedish dub were all Finno-Swedes. Instead of being seen as some sort of novelty, people took to it as the most spot-on casting direction they could have done, and 30 subsequent years of reruns certainly had its way on public perception. And that's it. From that point onwards, it was not only undeniable, it was basically impossible to have the Moomins not be Finno-Swedes. They had to speak the way they do, and this integral link withheld for over half a century has actively helped the recognition for this branch of Swedish. In popular terms, Finno-Swedish is sometimes playfully referred to as Moomin-Swedish. And from that angle, maybe it is a bit strange that no other language gives Moomintroll a bit of a Finnish accent to further emphasize his cultural identity. After all, he is from Finland, isn't he? Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. We would like to thank our Patreon supporters for making this video possible. Ali Menthol, Andreas Argulander, Andrew Jones, Ashel Seasucker, Lafayette, Aaron Rain, Bald Space Marine 33, Basklin, Ben Clark, Ben personally approves this message, Clara Rose, Biopanda, Botch Frivarg, Casey Explosion, Chloe, Cult of the Hyena, David J. Bradley, Ember, Emil Olin, M. Rasa, Flynn Flamberge, Gage McColgan, Gothic Garfield, Huang Wu, Isaac Abrahamsson, Jerry Olsson, Joel Nilsson, Karen Scholz, Iantu, Luke, Baba Kenzie, Magnus, Mar B, Mattias Kraman, Melang Rubin, Meowmix64, Miko, Morgan, Nate Kiernan, Nishtvet, Oscar Funes Galindo, Preston Manes, Sweet Pink, Riley Rose Smith, Roe, Silly Rookie, Anonymous, Starfighter, Dat Yes, Tommy Håkansson, Trash Baby, Tough Emily, Vexelbun, and Saifi. If you want to appear on this list as well, you can support us on Patreon, which gives you, of course, a part on the list and also access to our Discord, which is a fun little place where you can hang out with us and other friendly people. It's a fun time, I promise. Do it.